2 days ago, the president asked Nigerians to be patient and wait for palliatives, which he says are underway. Not too long, he wrote to the National Assembly to approve the $800 million World Bank loan and saw another 500 billion naira from the 2022 supplementary budget. That letter, in fact, was read on the floor of the House 2 days ago. So 8,000 monthly, that's 8,000 naira monthly to 12 million households over 6 months in the mode of digital transfers. In fact, it was read on the floor of the House by the Speaker. I'd like to take a listen to this one, and we'll get into the conversation.
Request for the amendment of the 2022 Supplementary Appropriation Act. I write to request the approval of the House of Representatives for the amendment of the 2022 Supplementary Appropriation Act in accordance with the attached. The request has become necessary in order to, among other things, source for funds necessary to provide palliatives to mitigate the effect of the recent removal of fuel subsidy on Nigerians. Thus, the sum of 500 billion naira only has been extracted from the 2022 Supplementary Appropriation Act of 819 billion 536 million 937,815 naira only for the provisions of palliatives to Nigerians to cushion the effects of fuel subsidy removal. While I hope that the House of Representatives will consider this request expeditiously, please accept, Right Honorable Speaker, the assurances of my highest consideration. Signed, Bola Ahmed Tinubu.
So let's put this into proper perspective, right? That supplementary budget was actually introduced by the previous government, the Muhammadu Buhari administration, and it was particularly to solve the issues of flooding, to provide succor, rebuild infrastructure as a result of the floodings which we saw last year. Of course, very sad tales from that particular flooding, over 800 billion naira. And now President Tinubu has asked for 500 billion naira from that supplementary budget. That's on the one hand. He's also sought approval for the $800 million World Bank loan. That's approximately about 600 billion naira. And that's a breakdown of just what we're faced with as a nation in terms of the households, the number of people in the households, and what have you. So together, 500 billion naira plus 600 billion naira, that's about 1.1 trillion naira. And it's expected that all of this will be geared towards the 8,000 naira per month monthly transfer to 12 million poor and low-income households over 6-month period. Don't worry, don't let the figures scare you. For some people, they say we've been down this road before. For some others, what are the options really? After all, the president had said, let the poor breathe. Well, let's speak to a man who has been down this road before in some sense, but in a previous administration, that is Professor Magnus Bakol, as former chief economic advisor to former president and CEO of the National Planning Commission. He's the executive chairman, Economic Growth and Development Center, joins us on the program this evening. Thank you for joining us on Politics Today.
Kade, I can barely hear you, but I was able to hear what came out of the National Assembly, but I could barely hear you. But I suppose you're asking me about my take on the president's decision to award 8,000 naira per household.
I had not gotten to the question just yet, but yes, I was going to ask you that because you've been involved with the National Poverty Eradication Program. And this is a program now targeted at the vulnerable, low income and the rest. For you, is this on target? Do you think this is on target?
Okay, so I hear you now a little bit better. Well, first of all, as you know, I hope many people know, I introduced the Conditional Cash Transfer Program into the country under the presidency of Obasanjo. So during President Obasanjo's term, I was after finishing as economic advisor to the president, I moved on to NAPEP and introduced the conditional cash transfer at that time, which was adopted by the previous administration. I don't suppose that what we're trying to do now is a conditional cash transfer program. It may look like it, but it is not it in terms of the evidence. So I'm not going to try to address it as a conditional cash transfer program. Rather, I'm going to try to see it as an attempt on the part of the administration to try to mitigate the sufferings of the people, which has really been immense, as we have all seen. So in that light, I mean, I'm looking at it not as some sort of a conditional cash transfer, but as some sort of an attempt, to help the poor that are suffering. But again, I'm not so sure that we should call it a palliative for removing the fuel subsidy. It is something to do. I think that the president is doing his best. From what I've seen so far, the administration, they've attempted to do some of the things that the markets are looking for. We see happening in the stock market. The stock market reacted well. International community reacting well to what the president is doing. But on this particular one, if this is the measure that they're using to sort of offset the suffering or to mitigate the suffering of the people as palliative, I'm not so sure that they're right on the mark on this one.
Why do you think that this is not on target? Because a lot of people will say, well, something is better than nothing. There's that saying, half bread is better than none. 8,000 for some people might be chicken change, but some say for some others, that's something.
Yeah, well, this is something, as I said. I mean, this is an attempt by the administration to do something, and I commend them for trying to do this. If I were to be in a position to suggest, I might have suggested something different. I can see the aversion to any kind of fuel subsidy, but I'm not so sure that in the first place we should have taken the whole thing away completely. We could have done it in phases to make people adjust. This is the problem that people are having now is the adjustment problem. So we have conditions where you can address switching issues and changing issues. So the people cannot switch. Our society, we are not in a position to be able to switch that easily from the dependency that we've had, especially for the poor. And I admit we did not need the kind of fuel subsidy that we were getting. Even in Canada, where I am now, over 11 years ago, they made away with their own fuel subsidy programs. Although they still subsidize fossil fuels, but at the production level. So in many countries, even in the United States, they subsidy at the production level, not so much at the consumption level. So I understand that. But it is not easy for the administration to tackle this problem. I'm not going to try to say that, they've left something that they could have done on the table. They are facing a very difficult situation, and they're attempting to try to resolve that by doing what they have done. But what I would have suggested is that you use computers, you use electronics, you use machines, you use a type of beavers. I hate to bring up beavers, but there are ways that you could have devices at the gas stations and commercial vehicles, taxis, and those in commercial transportation would be able to get fuel at a slightly, not completely subsidized method, not using a completely subsidized method, but they could have tried to subsidize those using commercial vehicles. I think that approach could have been done. I'm not so sure if they looked at it. They have very good experts that are looking at a bunch of things, so they may have, I don't know. But if I were to look at it, I would have gone that way because you see, there's a transmission problem. We've got guys that are transporting our food stuff from the rural areas where we're already having difficulty because of banditry, because of insecurity. Prices are high already. You see where the food inflation is extremely high for our people. General inflation already extremely very high. So we don't want to compound things, by making transportation costs even much cheaper. So I would have tried to address transportation costs. It is not easy to try to go across board and provide public transportation to every part of the country. But let me just say this before I leave this particular point. I think also that the federal government is taking on too much. And this is a tendency that we see in our federal system. Our formation suggests that we are federal. We have this sort of federal formation. We posture like we're federal. But in many things, when we act, we don't act like we're federal. We have states and we have local governments. If I was with the administration, I would try to pass some of the responsibility to the state and local levels. I don't think that the presidency that the federal government should take this on completely by themselves. In fact, what I would have suggested is that states try to see what they can do to mitigate the matter as far as they can. And then at the federal level, we will support them.
And that's a very important point you raised, Prof.
Whatever it is that they're contributing.
That's a very important point you raised, because questions are being asked about what states are doing, because you'd expect that the other levels of government will be actively involved in this. But, I mean, the federal government has come up with a proposal.
I'm not hearing you that well.
Oh, dear. I do hope you can hear me now, Professor Pakol.
A little bit. I hear you a little bit, yes.
All right. So let me just go to this point which you made. By the way, we did invite the presidency to come shed more light on this, because there's still a lot of questions to be answered about how this will be implemented, but they were not able to join us today, hopefully in the coming days. But you made an interesting point about the conditional cash transfer, which you say that the previous administration took on board, something that you worked on as well. But you think that this government is not using that model, that conditional cash transfer model. So what should conditional cash transfer look like? Because looking at the letter which was written, it referenced digital transfers. So what should conditional cash transfers look like? And what do you think this one looks like that they're not looking alike?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. Well, first of all, a typical conditional cash transfer, as the name implies, means that I'm going to give you this money on condition that you do certain things. And usually the basic things that households are typically expected to do is to make sure that their kids go to school and that they're getting health checks. Basically, what we're trying to do here is to show up our human capital development programs. And I can tell you right now, the problem we face in the country today is really stemming from a very grave deficiency in human capital. The reason we have the problems that we have is not so much because of the subsidies that we had, except for the fact of the abuse that we saw in the subsidy program. But outside of that, our problem is a production problem. If we had enough money, like Saudi Arabia, some of the other countries, we would subsidize. There would be a problem with an oil-producing country subsidizing is poor. The fact of the matter is the president is right. We don't have the capacity to continue that program. There's no doubt about that. We don't have the capacity to do it. And that's because we are not producing enough. We don't have the human capital to be able to produce as much as we should. Then when I say human capital, I'm talking about the economic and professional potential to mobilize the resources that the people of the world want, to be able to cause us to produce goods and services that the people of the world want. We are having trouble producing just for ourselves in the first place. So we have a production problem in the country. And I suppose this is what the president is addressing. Now, I'm also happy that the president is paying good attention to poverty. And I've heard him say this numerous times, even when he looks at his industrialization programs, he talks about poverty eradication, which is pretty good. But the thing is what to do. This is a serious and grave challenge. This particular program is not a conditional cash transfer program. If you want to do a conditional cash transfer program, you got to be in it for the long term. You're not going to do it for 6 months. You're not going to do it for a few months. Now giving 5,000 naira, 8,000 naira to households every month is good. It's better than zero, as you said. It's a pretty good thing to do. But you got to be able to sustain it, and you got to be able to get the people off the program eventually by having their kids go to school, so you don't have this so-called intergenerational transfer of poverty. So that program is very involved in countries like Brazil, Mexico, that have done wonderful jobs with their conditional cash transfer programs, especially like Brazil. They're talking millions of households, for a very long, like 11, 12 million households for a very, very, very long period of time. What I tried to do when I introduced the conditional cash transfer program into Nigeria was to do it so that you graduate off it. There is a component that I think that we need to add to it in Nigeria, which we have not tried to do, is what I call the Poverty Reduction Accelerator Investment. Basically, it sounds like a big expression, but it's not too big. Basically, what I mean there is to give loans to people, to provide microfinance to people. The microfinance program in Nigeria is not as good as it should be. The government should be involved, not in doing microcredit directly themselves, but in supporting microfinance firms to be able to stand up and to be able to provide microfinance to the people. The government may come and subsidize interest rates, but not to be involved directly in doing microcredit. We need to be able to marry that with a conditional cash transfer program if we want people to graduate off welfare. Otherwise, what you do is you then establish and probably institutionalize a welfare program, which we do not want in the country. So my
that's
program,
interesting.
the way I had it, there was an exit where you stay in the program for a while and then you're able to exit because of the poverty reduction accelerator investment component.
Okay, so let me take this part of the letter which was read in National Assembly, particularly about the World Bank's $800 million loan. And it says that the program, that's a letter from the president, that this program will stimulate economic activities in the informal sector and improve nutrition, health, and education outcomes for beneficial households. Do you still think that doesn't look like, well, people will still get to use this money, or at least it will help them to engage in some sort of productivity for the nation at large?
Yeah, I think that's the intention. Like I said, I mean, the administration is not really doing anything wrong. I mean, they've got the money, they've got to try to use. This is a way of using it. What I was just saying is that if you are looking at ameliorating the problems created from the subsidy removal, which I admit we had to remove the subsidies, probably not all at once at the same time. But if you're trying to ameliorate the condition, and this is not the method, but if you want to support the poorest of the poor, yeah, this is a way of doing it. Now, notice that the money will finish, as they say. Right. At some point, the thing will end. So if you're going to do a typical program where you want to support farmers or people, you got to stay with them for a long time, for longer than 6 months. Not just, we can't always be in a mode where we're depending on the World Bank and the IMF and some sort of SDG programs. When somebody comes and tells us something, is then when we do it. We can do these things by ourselves. We have the capacity to come up with our own programs that can be sustained for a very long period of time. I went to Mexico when I was in government to try to see what they did. And I told them that their program could fail someday. And they obviously had trouble with their program. They had to scale it down because I told them their program would fail because it didn't have a way of making it to be sustainable. And so we have to start looking at how we can make our program sustainable. If you look at agriculture, we have never grown anywhere near 5% agriculture. In terms of looking at the GDP component, that sectoral component of GDP, we have never grown anywhere near 5% in the last 10, 15 years. You cannot succeed as a country if the agricultural sector is not growing. It represents 25% of GDP and growing at a measly rate of 2 to 3%, well under the population growth rate. That we can be successful doing.
Prof, quite a number of issues to raise. Just to add that, the president had also declared some sort of state of emergency on food security. We're still yet to see what that really entails. Again, the devil is in the details. I would expect government to come forward to tell Nigerians, what these issues entail. But I'd like you to speak to this question on the lips of a lot of Nigerians, which is, who should get this money? There are a lot of people who are hoping that their names will be on that list. Again, 8,000 naira is some money anyway. From where you sit, from your experience, which is quite broad, how should the government decide? By the way, the World Bank is actively involved in this as well. In fact, the World Bank looked at all of the fine details of how it will be dispersed. But what should be, should I say, prerequisites of who should get this transfer?
Very, very good question. Now, first of all, as I said before, with all due respect to the World Bank, I mean, they don't always know everything. I mean, sometimes we get this impression that the World Bank has said. I mean, the World Bank said something that's good, their own best condition of expertise. But I think we have experts in the country that can determine these kinds of things for us by ourselves. I think that we need to work with the local communities and the local governments and state governments and try to get those numbers from the bottom up. I don't think that we have the expertise at the federal level to drill down, to go capture these numbers. This is something we could have done a long time ago. And one of the problems we also have, problem of resilience. So we are not, that's why we're facing this. We are usually not resilient because we don't prepare to be resilient. And so when things hit us like this, we have no buffers. We have no way of waging any kind of a defense against conditions like this when they come up. So that's what happens. So we face it. Now, suddenly we've got to get these numbers, and we don't have very good mechanisms for getting these numbers that are clean, that are efficient. I don't want to use the word fraud-free, expression fraud-free, but that is an expression that can pertain to this. So we will have to quickly go to state and local governments and try to get a head count of the people, the poorest of the poor. There are ways of knowing that maybe next time we'll have another show where we discuss how to do it. But it can be done without going to the World Bank, and we can do it ourselves. So, but I think the federal government by itself cannot do this. They need to have good association relationship with the state governments and the local government. That's something we miss quite often. When I was in that position at the federal level, the people who recall this recall I worked very, very closely with state and local governments because you can't do these things by yourself, just at the top. And so we have to quickly, it can be done quickly. They have the National Economic Council where they meet, chaired by the vice president, so they can meet and begin to look for a way to actually get the right numbers. Otherwise, you get rubbish. You get wrong numbers that don't help the matter at all. Now, again, when you do this thing, what are you trying to do? You are trying to support, you're presumably supporting the rural peasants that are producing the food that we eat in the country today. And that's not a bad thing. My problem is that going to be just for 6 months? Then you're done? Then what happens after that? And that's why we also need a lot of training. We need a lot of training, something that we don't do in the country. When I'm talking about human capital development, I'm not just talking about going to school. I'm talking about the ability of our people to produce goods and services. And you get that through training. A rural peasant people can be trained. Nobody's
quite interesting point, really. Pardon me, Prof. Quite interesting point. And, in terms of the register, I mean, you've talked about how we need to work on our data gathering or having that sort of register.
I'm not hearing you quite as well.
Oh, dear.
In terms of the register, you said.
Yes, I was trying to say that, well, the government had said that, well, there's a national social registry, there's also the rapid response register and all of that. So to that extent, the government says, well, there's a register. We have these names, really. They're registered. If I will use SMS and all of that. But I'd like you to speak to a point which has been recurring in some of the responses you've given as someone, again, who has been involved with trying to reduce poverty. Every government has had some sort of poverty reduction program. You were at the helms of affairs during the Obasanjo administration. Subsequent governments had another thing. Some changed the name, some maintained it. But poverty, instead of reducing, keeps growing. So what is the fundamental issue here with all of these policies? Is it a problem of corruption? Is it diversion of the monies? Because the president had said he doesn't want the money to get in the wrong hands. So if we'll be disbursing funds again, what should we pay attention to so we don't end up widening that poverty gap?
Yeah, thank you. Well, you can't end poverty just by giving money to people. That's not the way to end poverty. And our politicians have to understand that. It's good if you, what they call dash in Nigeria, you just dash somebody money. It's good. They have it in their pocket for that time. But what we need is to give people capacity. The reason why we continue to have poverty is because we're not training people, we're not training them to produce. You got to have the aim, you have to be intentional. You have to come at the local government level, at the state level, at the federal level. And I think this is something the president should be committed to have a way of institutionalizing human capital development in the country. If you go look at the data, and I don't like to do this, but I got to mention, if you look at the data between Nigeria and Korea from the 60s to date, you'll find there was a time when we were at parity in the 60s, in the mid-60s. But they have gone, so now their productivity is like 16 times more than ours. I measure productivity by GDP per capita. So that tells me that when their productivity is high like that, it tells me that they're doing something with their ability to produce. And that's from training. And then whatever resources they have, they're good to optimize them to provide the basic infrastructure and things to complement the training given to the people. That's basically what the problem is. There's no bigger than that. It's just a fact of training the people to be able to produce goods and services, staying with them, the goods and services that the people of the world want. That's what we want to do. And then provide the necessities, the basic infrastructure for them to be able to do that. That's basically what has to happen. Now, this has to be drilled down to the local government areas, to our communities. I'm saying that it is not something that President Tinubu by himself can sit in the villa with some advisors and just accomplish. It's not going to work that way. That's why it has not worked before. You see, he did not introduce this problem. This is a problem that's been with us all this time because we don't have the right approach to it. The right approach is how can we produce goods and services that we can export to the world? The only way you're getting export money today in dollars is from crude oil. That's the only way. That you're getting over 90% of your receipts from crude oil. That means you don't have other goods and services that you can sell to the world and get hard currency. That is the problem. When you don't have that, you will be poor. There's no way around.
Let's wind down on this one. With the benefit of hindsight, with the work done with NAPEP, and I speak to this because a lot of NAPEP, it's still quite popular in Nigeria with the tricycles. A lot of people still call it, keke NAPEP and all of that. But with the benefit of hindsight, what would you say was a major thing that stood in the way of implementing government policies, especially targeted at poverty reduction, but generally in the operations of government? What is that one thing that usually stands in the way of government's good intention, that is?
I'm sorry, what stands in the way of what? I'm sorry.
Of implementing government's good intentions. What's that one thing that this government should be wary of?
Well, it's the one thing that we know is this efficiency and intentionality. We got to be efficient. We have to use our resources properly, efficiently. When we say $10 for something or 10 naira for something, then that's what it is. We get the value for money. So we got to be able to do that. And then we got to be intentional. And I think that our leaders should be happy to come for some training, even here in Canada, in the United States. You see mayors, top level government officials going for training, making sure that they understand. Nobody knows everything all at once. So you got to have people be humble and ready to learn new things if you're a leader so that you can lead well. And I think that that's also a problem. We need to get our leaders to come to be able to learn new things, new ways of doing things, and then be intentional and committed and decisive on how to get it done. I think we have the capacity in Nigeria. We are a wonderful country.
Absolutely.
We are very well blessed, and we have all kinds of endowments, especially the human endowment. That's the number one thing we have. That's the biggest asset we have. We've got to invest in them.
Indeed. And some will say that's even bigger than our crude exports. But we'd like to thank you so much. Very interesting conversation we've had with Professor Magnus Kwekol. Thank you so much for your time on the program.
Thank you very much.